Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Spectator Sports. We cover sports from a spectator's point of view. This is episode number 142. I'm your host, Sebastian Fonseca. In this episode, we'll be recapping some major storylines coming out of the NBA and the NFL. But before we get into this week's content, please do us a massive favor. We are on the grind to 400 subscribers by the end of the calendar year, so it would mean a massive difference if you could drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you want to get more clips from Spectator Sports, we got that for you here on YouTube in our various playlists, as well as on TikTok. Plus, if you want to enjoy Spectator Sports from an audio-only experience, we got that for you on Spotify. I'll link everything in the description, and let's get into this week's episode. The Detroit Pistons are now 12-2 to start the 2025 season, riding an 11-game win streak, and now sit atop the Eastern Conference standings, which is their best start in over 20 years. Remember just 2 seasons ago when they were the laughingstock of the NBA, in a season where they won just 14 games, their fan base endured 2 months of brutal losing 28 straight games, tying an NBA record. We thought Cade Cunningham was a bust. He was under much scrutiny, and last year, Cade put all of that to bed as he had a breakout season, averaging 26 points a game, 9 assists, and 6 rebounds on career-high shooting percentages. Cade's been a guy who's capable of putting up 30 points and 10 assists on a nightly basis, while also finding ways to create offense out of thin air, whether it's via pass or creating his own shot, even on broken possessions. He bodies small defenders and outclasses bigger defenders by driving into the paint with his elite handle. In terms of his development, his ability to process defenses have gotten a lot quicker, and he's made sharper reads out of double teams while also being stronger, calmer, and more decisive when it matters the most. All season, Cade Cunningham has been super clutch, leading the Pistons offense to the best net rating in the fourth quarter, while also showing some flashes of being a great two-way player. Can you imagine once he regains his form as a shooter? Because to start this season, he's been a little off, but just imagine how lethal he'll be once his three-pointer starts dropping. He's taking another step to becoming an NBA superstar, and if he can improve his efficiency and the Pistons keep winning along the way, he's going to force himself into the MVP conversation. Like every contender with a superstar, they're going to need a reliable second option. Enter Jalen Duren. In year 4, Jalen Duren is taking the leap, averaging 20 points and 12 rebounds while playing under 30 minutes a game. He's rapidly evolving as a two-way player, anchoring the third best defense in the NBA, while also growing as an offensive player. Early in his career, he was restricted to just being a simple lob threat, but now he's a legitimate offensive contributor, taking guys off the dribble, passing out of double teams, and gets to the line pretty often and knocks them in at a pretty consistent rate. Together with Cade, they build an effective half-court offense, which something you wouldn't say about Detroit in the past. When defenses come to trap Cade Cunningham, Jalen is right in position to be a dribble away from a shot at the rim, whether it's a layup or a dunk, and routinely punishes opposing defenses as a short roller. He works well with Cade as an effective screener, which allows Cade to get downhill into the paint, and this could be the year that Jalen Duren breaks out as an all-star as Cade Cunningham's sidekick. While Cade and Jalen have formed a stellar duo, Ausar Thompson is doing everything he can to make it an elite trio. Ausar is kind of a guy that does it all as a point forward. He does the dirty work on the glass while also being a slasher to the rim as an elite off-ball cutter, and Ausar has the tools to be a top-flight wing defender while also being a great on-ball defender, as he's routinely able to funnel the offense into the waiting arms of either Isaiah Stewart or Jalen Duren. Ausar's game perfectly complements both Jalen Duren's and Cade Cunningham's, as they form an elite trio and form a strong core, including a guard, a wing, and a big. Detroit's identity is based on tough defense and dominates in the paint. They're second in the NBA in terms of defensive rating at 109.7, and then second in the league in half-court defense, where they have a defensive rating of 89. This unit is meant to make opposing offenses work for every bucket, while funneling everything into the middle of the floor, only for someone to come up with a key block or a deflection at the rim. Detroit's defense makes even the simplest of actions look like a chore. Azar Thompson starts it all at the point of attack, while Cade Cunningham and Jenkins erase angles and Duren and Stewart clean up the mess at the basket. All part of a defense designed to squeeze the life out of opposing offenses with smothering defense. They aren't quite OKC just yet, but they certainly have a similar formula. Mind you, Detroit is having all of this success early on in the season, despite the absence of Jaden Ivey. Despite being led by a young core where Cade Cunningham is 24 years old, Jalen Duren is just 22, Azar Thompson is also 22, Detroit still touts some solid veterans in their lineup. Tobias Harris and Duncan Robinson will be huge later on, as each have a ton of playoff experience. Duncan Robinson continues to produce at age 31, returning to the state where he broke out in college. The sharpshooter is knocking down 42% of his shots from deep, which ranks the second highest in his career. With Cade making the leap to being an NBA superstar and Jalen Duren's leap to becoming an all-star, this accelerates Detroit's timeline into becoming a contender for the Eastern Conference Finals. They also have some assets in terms of trade ammo to add even more talent before the trade deadline. In a year where the Eastern Conference is lacking veteran talent, it might be time for this young Pistons core to shock the NBA. For the second time in a 6-day span, the Philadelphia Eagles defense delivered in prime time with another suffocating defensive masterclass led by Vic Fangio. Detroit's offense came into Sunday night averaging 32 points a game, and they just scored 44 points against the Washington Commanders a week prior. The Eagles defense held them to just 9 points, coming off of a stellar Monday night performance, holding the Packers offense to just 7 points. Jalen Phillips has been a force since joining Philly at the trade deadline. He earned his first sack as an Eagle, leading the team in pressures for the second straight game, racking up 6 against the Detroit Lions. Philly's pass rush made Jared Goff uncomfortable all night, holding him to just 14 of 37 passing with a completion percentage of less than 38% as he completed just 2 of his final 18 passes. While the sack numbers weren't really there, the pressure was merciless and Goff was inaccurate, and it never felt like he could step into any of his throws all night long. And even when he did, the Eagles had 2 giants in the middle ready to swat the ball whenever it came their way. Jalen Carter had 2 pass deflections, but Jordan Davis was even better, having 3 pass deflections with 1 turning into a Cooper DeJean interception. Let's talk about the coverage, as it was phenomenal as the Eagles defensive backs stayed plastered to the receivers almost all night long. Quinion Mitchell and Cooper DeJean shut down Amon-Ra St. Brown as he didn't have a single catch matched up against either corner. Quinion Mitchell just might be a first-team All-Pro by the way he's playing, because he's been so sticky in coverage, and against Detroit, he faced 6 targets without allowing a single catch and also had 2 pass breakups along the way. So far in 2025, Quinion Mitchell has allowed just a 41.9 completion percentage, which is the lowest amongst any player since 2018. His ability to effectively take away one side of the field or follow the opposing team's top receiver in cases where he does travel has made him into one of the best lockdown corners in the NFL. Last year, Howie Roseman hit a home run by drafting Mitchell in the first round and then followed it up by double dipping in the second round and taking Cooper DeJean, creating one of the best cornerback tandems within a single draft. The Eagles defense did a great job on Jahmyr Gibbs, despite giving up a few big gains in the screen game, as he led all receivers on Sunday night. But he and David Montgomery basically did nothing in the run game. Much of that has to be attributed to the Eagles linebackers. Zach Bond led the team in tackles once again, and Nakobe Dean, who's been great since returning from injury, did a great job on the Lions' final drive where he shut down Jahmyr Gibbs in coverage, running stride for stride with one of the fastest running backs in the NFL. And on the very next play, Dean came up huge, sacking Jared Goff to force the Lions to settle for a field goal when they were down by 10 points. The Lions did have plenty of chances to score as they drove into Philadelphia territory on 5 different occasions, but only came out with a touchdown on just one drive. We all know that Dan Campbell is a gambling man, but against the Eagles, he came up empty as the Eagles stopped the Lions 5 times on 4th down. The first time was a 4th and short, and as Moro Ojomo wrapped up Jahmyr Gibbs in the backfield. The next time, Dan Campbell got a little bit creative and tried a fake punt, but the Eagles were right there to shut that down and later turned that into 3 points of their own. In the second half, the Eagles got 3 more stops, including one at the shadow of their own goal line in a 7-point game where it was not a bad idea to go for it, but Jalen Phillips gets around Penei Sewell and blows up the play as he and Jalex Hunt basically fold Jared Goff in half and forces an errant throw, shutting down the Lions' biggest threat of the night. Coming off the bye week, the Eagles' defense has become one of the best defenses in the NFL, improving from a middle-of-the-pack unit to now being a top 7 unit in just a 2-week span. Remember that this was essentially one of the youngest defenses in the NFL, and when you take out Brandon Graham, who just came back from retirement, the Eagles have young talent across all 3 levels of their defense, and they seem poised to carry them until the Eagles offense gets their shit together. Facing a 4th and inches inside their own 30-yard line, Nick Sirianni tried to put the game away by running yet another tush push. Problem was that Cam Jurgens was knocked out of the game due to a concussion, and the Eagles had Brett Toth in at center. Toth didn't seem to get as much push in the middle, and the Lions were able to shut down the tush push, giving them a chance to get back into this game. This gamble essentially handed the Lions 3 points, as this is now the 2nd straight game where Sirianni made a questionable decision on 4th down. The Lions were able to cut into the deficit to make it a 7-point game, but they couldn't get the ball back as the Eagles benefited from a terrible DPI call, which effectively ended the game. To be honest, when you look at it, it definitely looks like OPI by A.J. Brown, but for whatever reason, they call Rock Ya-Sin for DPI, and I really think even as an Eagles fan, this was a complete botched call. But going back to that 4th down situation, I'm all for being aggressive, but there's a time and place to be aggressive because I would run the tush push at midfield or in Lions territory, but when I'm inside my own 30 and knowing that I have my backup center in there, knowing that it's a 10-point game, and if I don't convert, I basically give Detroit 3 points. Why not punt it deep? If anything, the punt goes to the 20-yard line, maybe the 25-yard line. At the time, the Eagles defense was balling at that point. The Lions haven't been able to cross midfield for the entirety of the 4th quarter, but instead, you hand them the ball right in field goal range, and then you allow them to get back into the game. By kicking it deep, you just make that task even more difficult. There were 3 minutes left of the game at that point. The Lions would have to exhaust at least maybe a minute, minute and a half just to get into field goal range, and they would have to either burn timeouts and probably only be able to score after the 2-minute warning. But instead, by going for it and not getting it, you handed the ball inside the 30-yard line and within field goal range to give the Lions 3 free points. And if things don't go your way, and let's say that PI call was either an OPI or they didn't call it at all, that's an incomplete pass. The Lions get the ball back with a minute 43, and who knows, maybe they do end up driving down the field. They get a 2-point conversion, and they walk out of Philly stealing a win. So the margin was razor thin, and this is now the 2nd straight week that Sirianni has made a questionable decision. So I really hope that somehow, some way things change heading into Dallas, because this is a lot of weird late game decisions that we're seeing from Nick Sirianni. But overall thoughts on this game, I can respect Dan Campbell for sticking to his guns and staying true to his aggressive philosophy. He goes for it on 4th down more than any other coach in the NFL. And if you think about it, 3 were around midfield, and another, maybe you could have taken a field goal, but on a night where it's super windy in South Philadelphia, you're probably better off going for it. And the only thing I probably would say is that on that 4th and 1 to start it all, when you had it with Jahmyr Gibbs, if it's 4th and 1 and you're running up the middle, I would probably have David Montgomery in there. He's the larger back between the two. And I think just him just charging ahead, he's likely to fall forward for that first down rather than Jahmyr Gibbs, who is definitely a speedier back and elusive. But if you're trying to get him between the tackles in that short yardage situation, I'd rather give it to David Montgomery. And I personally have no issues with him going for it at that high of a cliff, given the circumstances. The problem is with this loss, Detroit, for the second time this season, looked kind of soft because to start the season, they were pushed around by the Green Bay Packers, and now this loss against the Philadelphia Eagles, they looked soft. They looked like a team that got run over at times, especially when they're trying to protect Jared Goff. I know that they have Penei Sewell. He's a first-team All-Pro right tackle, but if you look at the rest of the offensive line, it's not really that great of a unit. It's solid, and they're probably better than what they were week 1 against Green Bay, but they were clearly very overwhelmed, and that basically destroyed any chances of the Lions' passing game having any type of effect in this type of game. The run game was non-existent, and like I said, the passing game, outside of a couple deep passes to Jamison Williams and Amon-Ra, the only way the Lions could really move the ball was through the screen game. And it felt like a team that used to being the bully became bullied on Sunday night. And to look at the loss now in a vacuum, this loss drops them from the top spot in the NFC North down to 3rd, and now they're outside of the playoff mix entirely. They have Green Bay coming up in a couple weeks on Thanksgiving, and they're going to have to find a way to win that because they're already down that game to start the season. So a lot of work for Detroit to do, but they definitely don't look nearly as dominant compared to last season. The Eagles' offense continues to struggle, and while we talked about A.J. Brown and the drama last week, he did get several targets. He got 11 targets in this game, but only had 7 catches for 49 yards. But we know the offense was few and hard to come by all night long, but I thought that Jalen and him just weren't on the same page, and that's something we've seen them struggle with for the entirety of this season. Outside of the 1 touchdown drive, the Eagles' offense looked disjointed. Devontae Smith, who's been kind of on a heater in recent weeks, only had 1 catch, and Saquon Barkley once again struggled as he only had 3.2 yards per carry on Sunday night. But I do appreciate the Eagles sticking with the run game because despite the poor yards per carry average, the fact that they stuck with it for so long, Saquon did have his 3rd highest rushing output on the season. And you can look at the tape. There were several penalties that did hurt the Eagles, whether it was procedural penalties that wiped out 4th and short, 3rd and short opportunities, and then even a couple decent runs by Saquon Barkley were taken off the board by holding penalties. So I think the Eagles just really have to figure out who they are offensively. They have to fix these very correctable mistakes like the procedural penalties, the holding penalties, and then the passing game just has to be better. They can't go on like this where, they're struggling week to week, putting up anemic performances, and then once in a blue moon, you go off against like the Giants or the Rams or the Vikings. But they need to find some consistency because this is simply just not going to get it done. But if the Eagles can eliminate some of these self-inflicted mistakes, I think they beat the Lions by a comfortable margin in compared to just a 16-9 win. Going to this week where, again, Philly sports media is one of the most toxic news outlets in the entire world. They were really coming after Jalen Hurts, where there were some anonymous sources saying that numerous members within the Eagles organization were frustrated with Jalen Hurts' style of play, and that he might be too careful as a passer. So let's go back to 2023. That season was his only season where Hurts threw for double-digit interceptions, and honestly, that year, Hurts was kind of a turnover machine. He was trying to force balls to A.J. Brown or Devontae Smith, and there were too many throws into tight windows, and that led to a career high in interceptions. But ever since coming back from last year's bye week in 2024, he's made an adjustment. Including the playoffs, Jalen Hurts has 58 total touchdowns to just 7 total giveaways. And the Eagles' record in those games where Jalen Hurts starts and finishes is 22-2. We can point the finger to a myriad of reasons as to why the Eagles' offense has been particularly disappointing in 2025. But Jalen Hurts simply isn't one of them. The Atlanta Falcons' worst nightmare has come true. They've lost 5 games in a row and stand at 3-7. Their starting quarterback is done for the year, and they have no future assets to help fix their roster. To explain how they fell into this dire situation, we have to go back to the 2024 offseason. They just signed Kirk Cousins to a 4-year, $180 million deal. At the time, Kirk was recovering from a torn Achilles, but there was reason to believe that he could return to form. Fast forward just a few weeks later to the 2024 NFL Draft, the Atlanta Falcons are on the clock. Despite several needs across the roster, especially on defense, GM Terry Fontenot selects Michael Penix Jr. with the 8th overall pick, a move many thought was strange considering that they just gave Kirk Cousins $100 million guaranteed just a few weeks earlier. Kirk and his agent were totally blindsided as they didn't know until just moments before the selection was made. The intention was to try and shore up the quarterback room, have a veteran to win now, while the rookie sits back, develops, and takes over in what was envisioned to be a seamless transition, just like the Green Bay Packers from Brett Favre to Aaron Rodgers to later Jordan Love. The problem is both newly acquired quarterbacks were considered to be damaged goods. Kirk Cousins, as previously mentioned, was coming off of a torn Achilles, and Michael Penix Jr. was a redshirt senior who played 5 years in college and had a long history of injuries, including 2 ACL tears, plus injuries to each of his shoulders as he entered the NFL at 24 years old. Despite the concerns, Kirk Cousins and the Falcons were off to a hot start with a 6-3 record, including a 2-0 sweep of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But in November, Cousins started to taper off, throwing 9 interceptions within a 5-game span, as the Falcons lost 4 straight games and lost their once firm grip on the NFC South. In Week 15, Kirk Cousins was finally benched in favor of Michael Penix Jr. And while Penix did show some flashes in his 3 games to finish the season, the Falcons ended up missing the postseason entirely. However, the front office and coaching staff knew that this wasn't on him, and they wanted to give Penix Jr. the full offseason to get as many reps with the ones as possible. Atlanta did try to offload Cousins in the offseason, but nobody wanted him, and the Falcons would be stuck with the league's most expensive backup quarterback. Come April, it was draft season once again, and the Falcons were in desperate need to fix one of the worst pass rush units in the NFL, as they consistently finished within the bottom 10 since making the Super Bowl almost a decade ago. With the 15th overall selection, the Falcons select Jalen Walker out of Georgia, but later trade back into the first round to take James Pierce Jr. The trade came at a hefty price, as the Falcons gave up their own second-round pick in 2025 and a 7th rounder, but also a 2026 first-rounder. The move faced heavy criticism across the NFL. I'm all for aggressiveness, but come on, man, what was Terry Fontenot thinking here? James Pierce Jr. at best was slated to be a late first-round selection or an early second-round pick, and many people had him going in the top 40 on their big boards. If you look at each of the remaining teams in the first round, none of them had a real need at edge rusher with the exception of the Philadelphia Eagles. So if you maybe wait until day 2, that price drops significantly and you wouldn't have to mortgage the future. And just for comparison, the Giants traded up themselves to select Jackson Dart, and they only gave up a 2025 second-round pick and a 2026 third-round pick in the process. The Falcons were playing high risk high reward, essentially double dipping in the first round of each of the last two drafts. Maybe Fontenot's judgment was clouded by fear, but that doesn't mean you risk future assets for an edge rusher who's not even a top tier guy at his position. Fontenot would go on to continue this strategy by drafting safeties Xavier Watts and Billy Bauman in later rounds. To start the 2025 season, the Falcons got off to a rough start, as their defense gave up a late touchdown to Baker and the Bucks to lose their season opener. They would later go on to get shut out by the Carolina Panthers 30-0, but things momentarily seemed to get back on track as they had a great performance against the Buffalo Bills on Monday Night Football. Their defense forced Josh Allen into 2 interceptions, and their offense exploded in every facet. This was the offense that many expected the Falcons to finally be, as they assembled a bunch of talent, particularly at skills positions, over the last few drafts. Bijan Robinson ran for 170 yards, and Drake London had over 150 receiving yards. But that was the last time the Falcons won a game, as they're currently on a 5-game losing streak and sit with a 3-7 record. James Pierce, the guy who Terry Fontenot moved heaven and earth for, only has 2.5 sacks on the season, ranking 92nd out of 116 pass rushers according to PFF. But that's not the worst of it, as in Week 11, the Falcons faced the Carolina Panthers and Michael Penix Jr. would exit the game with a knee injury. MRIs came back to deliver the worst news possible: a partially torn ACL, which abruptly ends Penix's sophomore campaign. This is now the 3rd ACL injury that Michael Penix Jr. has suffered in his football career, and this now spans across each of his knees. This was the scenario that the Falcons wanted to avoid at all costs. Their big signing in the 2024 offseason turned out to be a complete bust, as Kirk Cousins couldn't sustain his pre-Achilles form, completely falling apart within a 14-game span, and their heir apparent Michael Penix Jr. is now out with another season-ending injury. Amidst a lost season, some Falcons fans might say, well, at least we can address things in next year's draft. Well, about that. Remember, the Falcons no longer control their first-round pick, and that's already slated to be a top 8 selection in 2026. So just when you thought you could rebuild the roster, it's going to be significantly hindered thanks to this reckless trade. The Rams, who now own the Falcons selection, are competing for a Super Bowl, and they currently sit the best record in the conference, and now have a chance to draft another young stud, as Atlanta has handed them a potential top 5 selection. Since Matt Ryan's departure, the Falcons haven't been able to find his successor, and especially after the retirement of Tom Brady, the NFC South was wide open. Baker Mayfield at the time was a reclamation project at best. The Carolina Panthers slated to draft Bryce Young with the top overall selection, and the New Orleans Saints were a team full of mediocrity. And the division was there to be taken for the Atlanta Falcons, but Terry Fontenot just couldn't get the quarterback position right. He tried with Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder, and both moves were total busts. And Arthur Smith was the scapegoat, as he was fired after 3 consecutive 7-10 seasons, and Terry Fontenot got a second shot when the Falcons brought in Raheem Morris. But once again, Fontenot tried to do a little bit too much by double dipping at various positions, leading to the Falcons facing their worst case scenario: quarterback purgatory. His approach to trying to win now while also trying to build for the future completely backfired. In 2024, there were several needs across Atlanta's roster, particularly on defense, and instead he takes Michael Penix Jr. In 2025, seemingly trying to overcorrect his mistakes from the year prior, he takes 2 edge rushers while mortgaging the future. His failure to address glaring needs at quarterback while also letting the defense continue to be one of the worst units in football will likely lead to his dismissal. In terms of coaching, don't even get me started, because this coaching staff has been a major disappointment for the Atlanta Falcons. After years of assembling top-tier offensive talent, particularly Bijan Robinson, Drake London, and building a solid offensive line in the process, this coaching staff can't figure out how to utilize these talented pieces on offense. Offensive coordinator Zach Robinson is trying to run some sort of college offense. Head coach Raheem Morris was far too slow to make the switch from Kirk Cousins to Michael Penix Jr. after seeing Kirk Cousins throw duck after duck for over a month. And after that 6-3 start, The Falcons have gone just 5-13 since. Raheem's poor in-game decisions and overall terrible management of the team have contributed to the situations which the Falcons stand in today. There's still a lot of unknowns with Michael Penix. When he was healthy, he didn't really have a signature performance. With this latest injury, there's no guarantees he will be the same player upon his return. This year was supposed to be essentially a do-over of his rookie season, but without flashing any sort of potential, it's unknown whether this new regime, should Arthur Blank decide to clean house, would accept Michael Penix as their guy. So far, across 2 seasons, Penix has started just 12 games, and like I said, he hasn't really flashed a lot of potential. Usually, a new head coach and GM are hired to either fix a quarterback who hasn't lived up to expectations, whether it be injuries, whether it be lack of supporting cast, and then if they haven't been able to fix them after maybe 1 or 2 seasons, they simply move on and find the team a new starter. But the fact that Penix was not selected by this potential new regime, this could force them to accelerate the process and search for Atlanta's new signal caller as early as 2027. The Falcons are slated to miss the postseason for the 8th year in a row, and they will likely clean house by season's end. With the uncertainty at quarterback and the lack of future assets, this makes this franchise an unattractive destination for a future new regime. Due to some costly miscalculations, the Falcons have a massive bill to pay, and they have no one to blame but themselves. Thanks everyone for tuning into this week's episode of Spectator Sports. Remember, we are on the grind to 400 subscribers by the end of the calendar year, so it means a massive difference if you could help us out by dropping a like on this video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you want to get more clips from Spectator Sports, we got that for you here on YouTube and our various playlists, as well as on TikTok. Plus, if you want to enjoy Spectator Sports from an audio-only perspective, we got the audio on Spotify. Shout out to Joy for editing this podcast, and I'll catch you all on the next one. Take care, everybody.